May 7th, 1945, Wright Field, Ohio. The war in Europe ended yesterday, but inside Hangar 18, something impossible sat under canvas tarps, waiting to rewrite everything the Allied forces thought they knew about flight. Captain Robert Wilson stood 30 feet from the aircraft, his hands trembling despite the May warmth filtering through the hangar's high windows. He had flown P-51 Mustangs over Berlin, survived flak storms that turned the sky into iron rain, watched friends spiral into German soil wrapped in flames. Nothing had prepared him for this moment. The mechanics who uncrated it that morning refused to go near it after sunset. They called it the Devil's Machine. Some crossed themselves when they walked past. The Messerschmitt Me 262 gleamed under the work lights like a weapon from another century. Its swept-backed wings caught the fluorescent glow in ways that seemed to defy geometry. But what stopped Wilson's breath, what made his chest tighten with something between awe and dread, was the absence. No propeller, no radial engine cowling. Just two smooth, bulbous nacelles slung beneath the wings, their intake mouths dark and hungry. Colonel Edmund Davies approached from the office corridor, his footsteps echoing against concrete. His face carried the weight of 3 years commanding experimental flight operations. He had seen every prototype America could build. None of them looked like this. Intelligence pulled it from an airfield outside Munich, Davies said, his voice barely above a whisper, despite the hangar's emptiness. April 26th, found it hidden under hay bales and camouflage netting. The Luftwaffe pilots burned everything before they ran. Maps, manuals, maintenance logs, everything except this. Wilson circled the aircraft slowly, his engineer's mind trying to process what his eyes refused to believe. The fuselage was cramped, barely wider than a coffin. The canopy sat low and flush, offering minimal visibility. This wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for one thing only: speed that would make conventional fighters obsolete. "Where's the engine?" Wilson heard himself ask, though he already suspected the answer would change everything. Davies handed him a folder stamped with red classification marks. Inside, grainy reconnaissance photographs showed Me 262s climbing at impossible angles, leaving American bombers behind like they were standing still. Gun camera footage captured gray shadows accelerating through formations, too fast for the cameras to track properly. Mission reports from bomber crews described attacks that defied physics. Enemy fighters appearing from nowhere, tearing through formations, then vanishing before escorts could respond. The Germans called them Schwalbe, swallow, but our boys called them something else: the ghosts. Wilson knelt beside the starboard nacelle, peering into the intake. The smell hit him first: burnt metal, synthetic fuel residue, something chemical he couldn't identify. Inside the darkness, he could make out turbine blades frozen in perfect circular arrangement. His hand reached toward them, then stopped. Something about touching them felt like crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Jumo 004B turbojet," Davies continued, reading from a technical brief that arrived that morning from British intelligence. "No propeller, no reciprocating pistons. Air comes in the front, gets compressed, mixed with fuel, ignited, and expelled out the back at supersonic velocity. The thrust pushes the aircraft forward. The British say it's the future. Our engineers say it's impossible." The sun had set completely now. The hangar's work lights cast long shadows across the Me 262's camouflage pattern, mottled grays and greens that seemed to shift and blend depending on the angle. Wilson stood and moved to the cockpit. Through the canopy glass, he could see the instrument panel, gauges and switches labeled in German, but the layout was familiar enough. Throttle quadrant, fuel mixture controls, weapons selector. This was a fighter aircraft, just one that operated on principles American aviation had barely theorized. "There's something else," Davies said. He opened another folder, this one marked Operation Lusty, the Allied program to capture and analyze German aviation technology before the Soviets could claim it. Inside were dozens of photographs, Me-262s lined up on captured airfields, rocket-powered Me-163 comets sitting in forests, flying wings designated Horton H-229 that looked like something from a science fiction serial. But one photograph stopped Wilson cold. It showed an Me-262 in flight, taken from a bomber's gun camera. The image was slightly blurred, but clear enough. Behind the aircraft, the air itself seemed to shimmer and distort, heat waves bending light into strange patterns. And at the rear of each engine nacelle, a cone of blue-white flame stretched backward like dragon's breath. "They flew these in combat," Wilson said, not a question, but a statement that carried the weight of implication. Davies didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had changed, carrying something darker. Enough that 8th Air Force wanted them priority captured at any cost. Enough that 3 bomber crews reported seeing them and were told their reports were classified. Enough that we've been ordered to get one flying within 60 days. Wilson looked back at the Me-262. In the dim light, it seemed almost alive, crouched and waiting. Somewhere in the nacelles, in those turbine blades and combustion chambers, lay secrets that could make America's entire fighter force obsolete overnight. The Germans had lost the war, but they had touched something first. They had crossed into a realm of flight that existed only in theoretical physics papers and late-night hangar discussions among engineers who dared to imagine the impossible. "Who's going to fly it?" Wilson asked. Davies met his eyes directly. "You are. First engine test is scheduled for dawn. We're going to fire it up cold and see what happens when we introduce fuel and ignition to a system nobody in this country fully understands." Wilson felt his mouth go dry. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that some lines shouldn't be crossed without understanding the consequences. But another part of him, the part that had chosen to fly when flight itself was dangerous, felt a pull he couldn't resist. This was the edge of everything. This was where the future began. "What if something goes wrong?" Wilson asked. "What if there's a reason the Germans abandoned it?" Davies closed the folders and turned toward the hangar exit. At the doorway, he paused, his silhouette framed against the Ohio darkness beyond. "Then you'll be the first American to die learning what they knew, and we'll find someone else to try again." The hangar door clanged shut. Wilson stood alone with the Me-262, its shadow stretching across the concrete floor like a dark prophecy. Somewhere in the nacelles, in those turbine blades and combustion chambers, lay the turbine blades. Somewhere in the nacelles, in those turbine blinds and combustion chambers, lay secrets that could make America's entire fighter force obsolete overnight. The Germans had lost the war, but they had touched something first. They had crossed into a realm of flight that existed only in theoretical physics papers and late-night hangar discussions among engineers who dared to imagine the impossible. "Who's going to fly it?" Wilson asked. Davies met his eyes directly. "You are. First engine test is scheduled for dawn. We're going to fire it up cold and see what happens when we introduce fuel and ignition to a system nobody in this country fully understands." Wilson felt his mouth go dry. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that some lines shouldn't be crossed without understanding the consequences. But another part of him, the part that had chosen to fly when flight itself was dangerous, felt a pull he couldn't resist. This was the edge of everything.
This was where the future began. What if something goes wrong? Wilson asked. What if there's a reason the Germans abandoned it? Davies closed the folders and turned toward the hangar exit. At the doorway, he paused, his silhouette framed against the Ohio darkness beyond. Then you'll be the first American to die learning what they knew, and we'll find someone else to try again. The hangar door clanged shut. Wilson stood alone with the Me-262, its shadow stretching across the concrete floor like a dark prophecy. Somewhere in the nacelles, in those turbine blades and combustion chambers, lay secrets that could make America's entire fighter force obsolete overnight.
May 8th, 1945. Wright Field, Ohio. 0547 hours. Dawn came like a held breath. The air inside Hangar 18 hung thick with the smell of aviation fuel and machine oil. But underneath it all lingered something else, the acrid chemical scent that clung to the Me-262's engine nacelles like a warning. Captain Robert Wilson had not slept. He had spent the night in the hangar office, reading every scrap of intelligence the British had translated from captured German documents. The words blurred together after midnight. Technical German mixed with frantic engineering notes. One phrase appeared repeatedly in the margins, written by different hands. Vorsicht, Flammen, Rückschlag. Beware, flame, backfire. Now, as pre-dawn light filtered through the hangar's eastern windows, a team of 6 engineers surrounded the Me-262 like surgeons preparing for an operation they had never rehearsed. Master Sergeant Eugene Kowalski, a propulsion specialist who had worked on every American radial engine from the Wright Cyclone to the Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp, stood beside the starboard nacelle with an expression Wilson had never seen on him before. Fear mixed with something close to reverence. "Sir, I need to say this once. I've been building engines for 23 years. I understand how they breathe, how they burn, how they die. But this," he gestured at the Jumo 004B turbojet, "this doesn't breathe like anything I know. The combustion happens continuously, not in controlled pulses. If something goes wrong, there's no way to stop the sequence fast enough." Colonel Davies emerged from the shadows near the hangar's control booth, carrying a clipboard thick with checklists that had been assembled from fragments and guesswork. The Germans flew hundreds of sorties with these engines. They're temperamental, but they work. We follow the startup sequence exactly as documented. Kowalski, you're on fuel flow. Wilson, you're in the cockpit managing throttle response. Nobody touches anything that isn't on the checklist. Wilson climbed into the cockpit as the sky outside shifted from black to deep blue. The seat was cramped, designed for smaller men than American pilots. The instrument panel stared back at him with German labels he had memorized during the night. Drehzahlmesser, RPM gauge, Abgastemperatur, exhaust gas temperature, Brennstoffmenge, fuel quantity. His hands found the throttle quadrant, twin levers that controlled thrust instead of propeller pitch. Everything felt backwards. Everything felt wrong. Through the canopy, he watched the engineering team connect external power units and fuel lines. The checklist called for a complex starting sequence: electrical power first, then fuel pump activation, then ignition of a small 2-stroke piston engine called a Riedel starter that would spin the turbine compressor up to operational speed before main fuel ignition. It was like lighting a fire in a specific order, each step building toward the moment when jet fuel would meet flame inside the combustion chamber. "Electrical power, on," Davies called over the hangar's intercom system. Wilson flipped switches, watching needles on the instrument panel jump to life.
the cockpit filled with a low electrical hum. "Fuel pumps, stand by." Kowalski's team opened valves beneath the nacelles. Wilson heard liquid rushing through lines, filling chambers designed to meter fuel with precision measured in fractions of seconds. "Starting starboard engine. Riedel starter, engage." The sound began as a high-pitched whine, a two-stroke engine mounted in the starboard nacelle screaming to life. Through the cockpit, Wilson felt vibration travel through the airframe. The whine climbed higher, more desperate, as the starter spun the turbine compressor faster and faster. Numbers on the RPM gauge began to climb. 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 rotations per minute. Ignition sequence armed. Wilson's thumb hovered over the ignition button. Everything he knew about engines told him this was the point of no return. Once combustion began, once fuel and air mixed with flame inside that combustion chamber, the reaction would sustain itself until fuel was cut or the engine tore itself apart. Ignite. He pressed the button. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The Riedel starter screamed. The turbine spun. The hangar held its breath. Then the starboard nacelle erupted with sound that should not exist. It was not the roar of a reciprocating engine. It was not the propeller wash Wilson knew from 1,000 takeoffs. It was a continuous, howling scream, like tearing metal and thunder compressed into a single sustained note that vibrated inside his chest cavity. The exhaust nozzle at the rear of the nacelle bloomed with blue-white flames 6 feet long, burning with an intensity that made the hangar's fluorescent lights seem dim. The Me-262 shuddered against its wheel chocks. Thrust. Actual thrust, pushing the aircraft forward without a propeller blade touching air. Wilson stared at the instruments as numbers climbed past any scale he understood. Exhaust gas temperature, 650 degrees Celsius. RPM, 8,700. Fuel flow, numbers that seemed impossible for an engine this size. "Starboard engine stable," Kowalski shouted over the howl of the jet. "Starting port sequence." But Wilson was not listening. He was watching something the engineers could not see from their positions. Through the canopy, reflected in the hangar's corrugated metal walls, he saw the heat distortion behind the engines creating waves in the air itself. And in those waves, in that shimmer of superheated exhaust, he suddenly understood what American bomber crews had faced. This was not just speed. This was physics rewritten. This was the future arriving too early. The port engine ignited with the same hellish scream. Twin cones of flame stretched backward, turning the hangar into a furnace of sound and fury. The Me-262 strained against its restraints like something alive and hungry. Wilson's hands shook on the throttle levers. One small movement forward and the thrust would increase. The howl would become a roar. The aircraft would surge toward the hangar doors with force that could not be contained. Davies' voice crackled over the intercom system. "Throttle up to 30%. Let's see what it can really do." Wilson hesitated. Through the windshield, he could see Kowalski backing away from the nacelles, his face illuminated by jet flame. Behind him, 2 other engineers had already retreated to the blast shields. The throttle levers felt hot under his palms, though that was impossible through his flight gloves. But the heat was not physical. It was the weight of knowledge, the burden of understanding that what sat beneath him was not just an engine, but a doorway. The Germans had opened it first. Now America was stepping through. He pushed the throttles forward. The scream became a roar, became something beyond sound, a physical force that rattled tools off workbenches and set the hangar doors vibrating in their frames. The Me-262 lurched forward 6 inches despite full wheel chocks and tie-down cables. Thrust readings climbed past anything the captured documents had mentioned. Then the port engine exploded. Not a catastrophic detonation, but a flameout. Combustion suddenly extinguishing, turbines still spinning, but the howl dying to a whistling wind-down. The aircraft yawed hard to starboard as asymmetric thrust tried to spin it in place. Warning lights flooded the instrument panel in red. The exhaust gas temperature gauge on the port side spiked into the danger zone, then dropped to 0. Wilson yanked both throttles to idle. The starboard engine wound down, its scream fading to a dying wail. Silence crashed into the hangar like a physical presence. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. Smoke leaked from the port nacelle's exhaust, not the clean smoke of burning fuel, but something darker, chemical, wrong. Davies's voice, tight and controlled. Shutdown complete. Engineering team, assess damage. Wilson, stay in the cockpit until we confirm no fire risk. But Wilson was not thinking about fire. He was thinking about the moment before the flameout, when both engines were running at barely a third of their rated power, and the Me-262 had strained against its restraints with force that would have made it accelerate faster than any American fighter could dive. The Germans had flown these in combat. They had pushed them to full power. They had touched speeds that made Allied fighters look frozen in
May 15, 1945. Wright Field, Ohio. 14:20 hours. 7 days after the flameout, Captain Robert Wilson stood in a different hangar, staring at a wall covered in photographs that told a story America was not ready to hear. The images had arrived that morning from Allied intelligence units sweeping through Germany. Factories hidden in mountain tunnels, assembly lines bombed to rubble but still recognizable, wind tunnels large enough to test full-scale aircraft, and in one photograph, taken at an underground facility near Nordhausen, a chalkboard covered in equations that made Wilson's hands go cold despite the afternoon heat. Colonel Davies stood beside him, holding a translated report from a captured German engineer named Hans Anselm. The man's words, filtered through a British translator's typewriter, read like confession and warning combined. "We knew what we were building," the report began. "We knew it would change everything, but we also knew we had started too late." The Me-262 sat in the adjacent hangar bay, its port engine disassembled across 3 workbenches. Master Sergeant Kowalski and his team had spent 6 days tracing the flameout to a fractured turbine blade, a hairline crack invisible to the naked eye, but catastrophic once centrifugal force exceeded 8,000 RPM. The blade had been cast from a nickel-chromium alloy the Germans developed when strategic materials became scarce. It was brilliant engineering born from desperation. It was also fatally flawed. "They were flying aircraft that should have been prototypes for another decade," Davies said quietly, reading from Anselm's report. The Jumo 004B had an operational lifespan of 25 hours before requiring complete overhaul. Some lasted only 10. Pilots knew that every mission might end with their engine tearing itself apart at altitude. Wilson moved to another photograph. This one showed an Me-262 crash site. The aircraft crumpled in a German field, its pilot still in the cockpit. The caption, typed in English by an intelligence officer, was clinical. "Catastrophic engine failure during combat operations. Pilot unable to maintain control during asymmetric thrust condition." The mathematics on the chalkboard photograph made sense now. The German engineers had not been designing the perfect jet engine. They had been calculating acceptable failure rates. How many pilots could they sacrifice per 100 sorties? How many engines could they build before their factories were bombed? How fast could they push technology
before it pushed back. "Sir, you need to see this," Kowalski approached, carrying a turbine blade that had been cut in half lengthwise. Under magnification, the metal's internal structure looked like a sponge, porous, inconsistent, riddled with microscopic voids where the casting process had failed to fill every space. This isn't precision manufacturing, this is desperate improvisation. They knew these engines were time bombs, they flew them anyway. Wilson thought about the bomber crews who had reported Me-262 attacks, the gray shadows that appeared from nowhere, tore through formations, then vanished. How many of those ghosts had made it home? How many had fallen from the sky when their engines betrayed them, victims not of American guns, but of their own impossible technology? Davies closed the report and looked directly at Wilson. "The British got one flying 3 days ago. Farnborough. Clean test, full power, sustained flight for 40 minutes. The pilot reported speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour in level flight. That's 100 miles per hour faster than anything we have." "Did he make it down alive?" "Barely. Port engine seized on final approach. He dead-sticked it onto the runway on one engine and momentum." He paused. "He wants to fly it again tomorrow." Through the hangar windows, Wilson could see the Ohio sky, clear, peaceful, innocent of the knowledge that hung in this room like smoke. America had won the war with propellers and piston engines, with massive production and brave pilots flying machines they understood. But the Germans had glimpsed something else. They had seen the future and grabbed it with both hands, even as it burned them. "Are we going to fly ours again?" Wilson heard himself ask. Davies handed him a new folder. This one marked Project Paperclip. Inside were orders signed by generals whose names carried weight that bent steel. Bring the German engineers to America. Learn everything they know. Build jet engines that work, that last, that turn desperate gamble into sustainable technology. Win the next war before it starts. You're going to fly it, but not this week, not this month. First, we're going to rebuild that engine with American metallurgy and American precision. We're going to test every component until we understand why it fails. We're going to take their magic and turn it into science." Wilson looked back at the photograph of the crashed Me-262, its pilot frozen in death inside a machine that represented everything humanity could achieve and everything it could not control. The Germans had not lost because their technology failed. They had lost because they pushed it beyond sustainable limits, chasing speed and power while their infrastructure crumbled around them. But they had been first. They had crossed the threshold. They had flown without propellers while America was still perfecting superchargers. What happens if we can't make it work? What happens if the technology is too far ahead of our ability to control it? Davies walked toward the hangar exit, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. At the doorway, he turned back. "Then someone else will. The Soviets are sweeping through eastern Germany right now, capturing the same factories, the same engineers, the same blueprints. This isn't about what we want anymore. It's about what the world becomes when the sky belongs to whoever dares to break it open first." He left Wilson alone with the photographs and the disassembled engine and the weight of understanding. The Me-262 sat in the next hangar. Its turbine blades would spin again. American pilots would push its throttles forward and feel thrust without propellers. The howl would return, that impossible scream of air and fire and physics bent into new shapes. But now Wilson understood the price. The Germans had paid it in pilots who flew machines designed to fail, in engineers who calculated acceptable losses, in desperation that turned innovation into sacrifice. America would build better engines, stronger alloys, sustainable technology. The future would arrive not as magic, but as engineering, not as desperate gamble, but as controlled progress. But standing in that hangar, surrounded by evidence of what the Germans had achieved and what it had cost them, Wilson felt something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. It was not fear, it was not awe. It was the knowledge that humanity had learned to fly beyond propellers before it learned to fly safely. That progress and wisdom did not always arrive in the same moment. That the future, when it comes too early, burns the hands that grasp it. Outside, an American P-51 Mustang flew overhead, propeller-driven, reliable, obsolete. The age of jets had begun, and there would be no turning back.